Welcome back. So the U.S. Secretary of State is in Israel and the Palestinian territories again. Some are saying that Condoleezza Rice's energetic timetable in the Middle East this year is no surprise. U.S. elections are coming up in a year's time. Looking into history, U.S. peace efforts in the Middle East have been more active at the end of a president's term. President Jimmy Carter saw out his term in 1979 with a deal between Egypt and Israel, ending 30 years of war. Carter was named the man who made the miracle happen. Madrid, 1991, the first time Israel sat down with all its Arab neighbors to discuss peace, and it was a feather in the cap for George Bush Sr. shortly before he stepped down in 1993. And in 2000, just a year before he left office, Bill Clinton hosted talks between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat at Camp David in the US. Critics in the region say that the Bush administration's credibility abroad is all but finished. But a good result this month at the Annapolis conference will be sure to raise Bush's profile ahead of U.S. presidential elections next year. Well, joining us again are our guests in Jerusalem, Ron Pundak, Director General of the Paris Center for Peace, in Ramallah, Qais Abdul Karim, member of the PLC for the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and in Washington, D.C., Aaron David Miller, scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a former senior advisor for the Secretary of State on Arab-Israeli negotiations. Gentlemen, welcome again. Mr. Abdul Karim, if I could start off with you in the second half of the show. Do you believe that the U.S. is an honest broker here?
I think that the Bush administration is keen on having this process going on, but I do not believe that they have the necessary political will to press the Israelis in order to make them comply with the requirements of the process. Even when you speak about the first phase of the roadmap, we have to remember here that the first phase of the roadmap is not strictly and simply security for Israel. It's also stopping completely the settlement activities by the Israelis and dismantling the so-called settlement outposts. Unless the United States and the Bush administration make the Israelis understand that they have also to meet their obligations according to the roadmap, I think that their role will be deficient, and that there will be no dramatic successes for the coming process.
Mr. Pundak, in Jerusalem, surely Israel's security can never be totally guaranteed unless the occupation ends and settlement activity ends.
Well, clearly, some American pressure will assist here. I think Israel must implement our share in regards to the roadmap, and our Prime Minister just yesterday mentioned also the Israeli demanded, which should also be met. But I think that there is another layer here, and this is the layer of Annapolis, in which I presume that an American paper maybe suggested to the sides might assist the two leaders to accept something that otherwise they would have difficulties to agree, meaning it's easier to sell to the public on both sides that they agreed upon something which was actually put on behalf of the Americans. I must admit that I was one of the negotiators of Oslo, and Oslo was negotiated in a bilateral way without any involvement of a third party, and I've always been in favor of a sincere dialogue between us Israelis and Palestinians, and I believe we can reach bilaterally an agreement. Having said this, now with the mistrust between the two sides, without an American intensive and serious role, we will not be able to make it. So my short answer, there is a need for a very dominant American role before Annapolis, during Annapolis, and also after Annapolis.
Mr. Miller, in Washington, D.C., is much of this about Bush trying to go out with a so-called peaceful bang before his presidency ends?
No, I'm not sure that's the appropriate way to describe it. The issues that will define the president's legacy have little or nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli issue. The issues that will define George W. Bush's legacy in the Middle East, his success or failure, will really only be two. One is Iraq and the outcome there. And a second issue, which is looming for next year, is Iran. we are suffering in the United States from a kind of Arab-Israeli fatigue. And the focus and the political center of gravity with respect to American interests in the wake of 9/11 has shifted from the Arab-Israeli issues to matters concerning proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the American occupation first of Afghanistan and then of Iraq, and the possibilities, serious possibilities, of another attack on the continental United States. These are the issues that will define the president's legacy. I think the renewed interest in Arab-Israeli peace has a lot to do with the Secretary of State and the fact that she needs a success. And I applaud her commitment in trying to achieve one. But the disconnect between the skill she is bringing and the will that may not exist in the White House to do the kind of diplomacy that is necessary, that, it seems to me, on the eve of the Annapolis conference, presents quite a gap. And unless that gap is closed, and the president commits himself to a very determined policy, not just for a day's conference, but over the course of the next year, we're unlikely to get very far.
Qais Abdel Karim in Ramallah. Hamas's political leader Khalid Mish'al says the conference is a, quote, malicious and naive game. Does Hamas gain from wanting nothing to do with the conference, particularly if it fails?
Well, certainly, if the conference fails, there will be more frustration and more trend towards extremism in the Palestinian public opinion. But I think that the rift between Hamas and the PLO factions and Fatah and the PNA is an internal Palestinian question, and I think it would be a very erroneous approach actually to deal with the coming negotiations through the perspective of Palestinian internal feud or disagreement. I think that if there is a meaningful and substantive peace process that promises a solution for the conflict that guarantees the main demands of the Palestinian people and the vision of two states, I think that this will command the majority amongst the Palestinian people, and that this will help also to surmount and overcome all Palestinian internal disagreements.
Mr. Pundak, what's the price of failure for Israel?
Well, the price of failure to everybody is a tragedy. I think we cannot afford a failure. It can happen, unfortunately, but I think that the fact that today you have still an Israeli overwhelming majority who is maybe with a mistrust and lack of hope, but still with a belief that this is the only option. And we have over 55–60% of Israelis now are saying that this is the only option. This majority will diminish. I'm afraid that it will lead to an increase of fundamentalism also in the West Bank, to the failure of the Fatah and Abbas and PLO system, introducing extremists to the West Bank. I mean, God forbid the black scenarios can be developed. And I mean, again, I'm thinking about a situation that occupation will continue and will be hardened. And this is, I mean, any occupation is bad for Israel, let alone bad for the Palestinians. But I think that we must proceed, we must move forward, because Israel today is a very prosperous country which never had such a good economy, development, growth, etc. All of these things could be shadow and might be in jeopardy. And really, security in Israel should be peace, or based on peace. Economy should be based on peace. And clearly, I mean, this is a kind of a situation that you have an equation, and as Mr. Miller said, security is first in Israel, but security and peace must go together.
All right, gentlemen, that's all we have time for on this edition of Inside Story. In Jerusalem, Ron Pundak, Director General of the Peres Center for Peace. In Ramallah, Qais Abdul Karim, PLC member for the Palestine Liberation Front. And in Washington, D.C., Aaron David Miller, public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center and former advisor for Arab-Israeli negotiations. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. And thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Bye-bye for now.